Rebecca Dawson stood on the edge of her immaculately kept front porch, gazing out at the quiet streets of her San Antonio suburb. It was the kind of neighborhood where nothing dramatic ever seemed to happen: lush green lawns, the faint hum of sprinklers, and the occasional dog walker. But for Rebecca, this picturesque environment felt like a beautifully wrapped box filled with nothing but emptiness. At just 28 years old, she should have been thriving. Her marriage to Timothy Dawson, an ambitious IT consultant, had always appeared flawless. He was dependable, responsible, and worked hard to provide for them, ensuring their home was a haven of stability. They had been married for 5 years, and on the surface, life seemed perfect. But underneath the veneer of their suburban bliss was a growing void. Timothy's job demanded long hours and frequent travel. Each time he left for another business trip, Rebecca felt an ache in her chest, a gnawing loneliness that crept in like an unwelcome visitor. Her days became a series of mundane routines, tidying the house, running errands, and scrolling aimlessly through her phone. Nights were worse, filled with silence and shadows that seemed to mock her isolation. It was during one of Timothy's trips that Ryan Carter re-entered their lives in a way Rebecca hadn't anticipated. Ryan, Timothy's best friend since childhood, had always been around, like an honorary member of the family. At 61, Ryan was nearly twice Rebecca's age, a retired police officer whose commanding presence and charm had always made him a comforting figure. He would occasionally drop by, usually to check in and make sure Rebecca was doing all right while Timothy was away. At first, his visits felt like harmless acts of kindness, someone looking out for her during her husband's absence. But something shifted. Ryan began staying longer during his visits. Their conversations, once light and filled with pleasantries, grew deeper. Rebecca found herself sharing things with him that she hadn't even told Timothy: her frustrations, her dreams, her fears. Ryan listened in a way that made her feel truly seen. His deep voice carried an authority that was both soothing and magnetic, and the way he seemed so confident, so sure of himself, filled her with a sense of intrigue. Rebecca hadn't realized how much she craved that feeling, being noticed, being heard. Each time Ryan left, she found herself looking forward to his next visit a little more. A smile lingered on her face longer than it should have after one of his remarks, and her heart began to race at the sound of his car pulling up. One evening, as the golden glow of the setting sun bathed the Dawson home, Ryan dropped by unannounced. Rebecca welcomed him in, grateful for the company. They sat in the cozy living room, sipping coffee and sharing stories. Laughter flowed freely, and for the first time in months, Rebecca felt truly alive. But beneath the warmth of the moment, there was an unspoken tension, a current of energy neither of them acknowledged but both felt deeply. As the evening wore on and Ryan stood to leave, something happened. Standing at the doorway, their conversation faltered, and in the pause, Ryan leaned in. His lips brushed hers, a fleeting, electric moment that left them both stunned. Rebecca pulled back, her breath hitching as her mind raced. Ryan immediately apologized, stumbling over his words before leaving abruptly. Left alone in the doorway, Rebecca touched her lips, her heart pounding. She knew it was wrong, everything about it was, but for the first time in years, she felt something other than emptiness. She felt alive. And that spark, reckless and intoxicating, would ignite a chain of events that would unravel everything she had ever known. Rebecca Dawson sat at her kitchen table, staring at her untouched coffee. The memory of Ryan's kiss haunted her thoughts. She had replayed it countless times, analyzing every detail, the warmth of his touch, the intensity in his eyes, and the sheer electricity that had coursed through her. It had been a mistake. It had to be. Yet, despite her guilt, she couldn't deny the way it made her feel, alive, desired, and dangerously exhilarated. When Ryan called the next day to apologize, Rebecca was conflicted. She considered ignoring him, pretending nothing had happened, but when his number lit up her phone, her fingers betrayed her. She answered, her voice trembling as she tried to keep her composure. "I'm sorry about last night," he began, his tone filled with regret. It was inappropriate. I don't know what came over me. Rebecca should have ended it there. She should have agreed, hung up, and gone on with her life. But instead, she found herself saying, maybe it wasn't just you. The line went silent for a moment, both of them processing her words. When Ryan spoke again, his voice was softer, almost conspiratorial. Can I come over? Just to talk. Against her better judgment, she agreed. That afternoon, Ryan arrived, his presence filling the house with an intensity Rebecca couldn't ignore. They sat across from each other, the air thick with tension. At first, their conversation was careful, guarded, as they tried to rationalize what had happened. But as the minutes passed, their defenses crumbled. Words turned into confessions, and soon, they weren't just talking about the kiss but everything, Rebecca's loneliness, Ryan's unspoken admiration for her, and the undeniable connection that had grown between them. What began as stolen moments turned into planned meetings. Ryan started coming over more often, under the guise of checking on her while Timothy was away. Their conversations became deeper, their touches lingered longer, and their boundaries blurred further with each encounter. Soon, Rebecca wasn't just looking forward to Ryan's visits, she was counting the hours until she could see him again. It wasn't long before their meetings moved beyond the Dawson home. Ryan suggested they meet at his ranch, a secluded property on the outskirts of town. The ranch, surrounded by dense woods and miles away from prying eyes, became their haven. Here, they didn't have to pretend or hide behind small talk. Here, they could be themselves, unguarded, passionate, and reckless. Their affair intensified quickly. What started as whispered conversations and lingering touches evolved into something far more physical, consuming them both. The thrill of secrecy only added fuel to their fire. Rebecca found herself checking her phone obsessively, waiting for Ryan's messages. She purchased a second phone, one Timothy wouldn't know about, just to keep their communication private. Every time she saw his name on the screen, her heart raced with a mix of excitement and fear. But the exhilaration came with a cost. Rebecca began to change in ways she couldn't fully control. She became more distant with Timothy, her patience with him wearing thin as her thoughts drifted to Ryan. The lies she told to cover her tracks became more elaborate, and she found herself weaving a web of deception she was certain she couldn't escape from. Yet, she didn't stop. She couldn't. Ryan, too, was changing. The calm, confident man she had always known began taking risks he wouldn't have considered before. He started parking his car further down the street to avoid suspicion, but even that wasn't enough. Neighbors began noticing his frequent visits. Maggie Taylor, the ever-watchful woman across the street, commented offhandedly to Rebecca one day, "Ryan's been such a great friend, hasn't he? Always looking out for you." The smile on Maggie's face didn't reach her eyes, and Rebecca's stomach twisted with unease. Despite the growing danger, Rebecca and Ryan couldn't stop. The ranch became their sanctuary, a place where the outside world ceased to exist. Here, their affair wasn't a betrayal or a sin, it was an escape, a stolen piece of happiness in a life that felt otherwise hollow. But the walls were closing in, and neither of them realized just how thin the ice beneath them had become. As December rolled around, their meetings grew more frequent and more reckless. They stopped caring about being seen or heard, convinced they were untouchable. Rebecca's lies to Timothy became bolder, and Ryan's excuses for his absences more flimsy. The passion that had once thrilled them now blinded them, pushing them closer to the edge of an inevitable disaster. The affair had become a firestorm, intense, consuming, and utterly uncontrollable. And as the flames grew higher, they failed to see the shadows of suspicion creeping ever closer, threatening to engulf them both. Timothy Dawson wasn't a man given to paranoia, but something about his wife had changed. Rebecca had always been attentive and warm, but lately, she was distant, distracted, and oddly secretive. At first, he chalked it up to the stress of his frequent business trips. The long hours away from home couldn't have been easy on her, and he felt guilty for the time they spent apart. But guilt wasn't enough to silence the growing unease gnawing at the edges of his mind. It was Maggie Taylor's comment at the neighborhood holiday party that planted the first real seed of doubt. As Maggie chatted casually with Timothy, she leaned in slightly, her voice laced with feigned innocence. "Ryan's been such a lifesaver, hasn't he? Always around to keep Rebecca company while you're away. It's sweet, really." Timothy forced a smile, but his stomach churned. Maggie's words lingered, replaying in his mind as he sipped his drink and scanned the room for Rebecca. She was across the room, laughing a little too brightly with a group of neighbors. For the first time, Timothy saw something in her demeanor he couldn't place, something that made him feel like he was standing outside a window, looking in on a life that was no longer his. That night, after the party, Timothy watched Rebecca more closely. He noticed the way she clutched her phone, never letting it out of her sight. When it buzzed with a notification, she glanced at it quickly, her expression flickering with something between anticipation and guilt. "Who was that?" he asked casually. "Just Maggie," she replied smoothly, slipping the phone into her pocket. But Timothy wasn't convinced. Maggie rarely texted Rebecca, and the excuse felt too rehearsed. Over the next few days, Timothy's suspicions grew. Rebecca started leaving the house more often, citing vague errands or last-minute plans with friends. She came home later than usual, her explanations growing thinner and less convincing. One evening, as she stepped out, Timothy felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name, jealousy, anger, or maybe just fear. It was then he decided to act. Timothy wasn't a man who leapt to conclusions without evidence. His years in IT had taught him the value of facts and proof. Quietly, methodically, he began to monitor Rebecca's actions. He started by checking their shared phone plan, noting an uptick in text messages and calls to an unknown number. The number felt familiar, but it wasn't until he cross-referenced it with an old contact list that the truth hit him like a gut punch. The number belonged to Ryan Carter. Timothy's hands trembled as he stared at the screen. He wanted to believe it was innocent, that Ryan and Rebecca were simply in touch because of his frequent absences. But the volume of communication, the frequency, the odd hours, told a different story. Determined to find answers, Timothy installed a small GPS tracker under Rebecca's car. He purchased it discreetly, ensuring she wouldn't suspect a thing. At the same time, he set up a hidden camera in their living room, strategically placed to capture anything unusual while he was away. He hated the idea of spying on his wife, but the knot in his chest told him he couldn't afford to ignore the signs any longer. The next week brought revelations Timothy wasn't prepared for. The GPS tracker revealed frequent trips to the outskirts of town, to a secluded area he recognized as Ryan's ranch. The camera, though less damning, caught Rebecca making hurried phone calls, her voice hushed and tense. She often glanced toward the front door, as if anticipating someone's arrival. The final straw came one Friday evening when Timothy returned home unexpectedly early from a supposed 2-day trip. Rebecca wasn't there. Her car was gone, and the house was eerily quiet. On the kitchen counter, she had left her phone, an oversight so uncharacteristic that it sent Timothy's heart racing. The screen was still lit up, displaying a message from Ryan. "I can't wait to see you tonight. Be safe." Timothy's blood ran cold. The words were intimate, unmistakable in their intent. He scrolled through the thread of messages, his heart sinking further with each one. The texts were filled with longing, confessions, and detailed plans to meet at the ranch. It was undeniable now, Rebecca and Ryan were having an affair. Timothy set the phone down, his hands trembling with anger and betrayal. The man he had trusted most in the world, his lifelong friend, had betrayed him in the worst way possible. And his wife, the woman he had vowed to love and protect, had been complicit in this betrayal. But Timothy wasn't ready to confront them. Not yet. He needed more than messages. He needed irrefutable evidence. His mind churned with plans, his emotions a volatile storm of fury and heartbreak. This wasn't just about catching them in the act, it was about reclaiming the truth, no matter the cost. The hunt for answers had begun, and Timothy wouldn't stop until he had the whole story. Timothy Dawson sat in his car, parked a few blocks away from his house. The glow of his phone lit up his face as he stared at the GPS tracker app. The red dot, representing Rebecca's car, was moving steadily toward the outskirts of town, heading for Ryan Carter's ranch. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the steering wheel, his mind a tempest of rage and betrayal. He had seen enough. For weeks, he had silently gathered evidence, the messages, the trips to the ranch, the hushed phone calls. Each new piece of the puzzle had cut deeper, twisting the knife in his chest. Now, as he watched the red dot stop at the ranch, all of his pain boiled over into a searing fury. Tonight, he would get the answers he deserved, no more lies, no more games. Timothy waited a few minutes before starting his car, following the route Rebecca had taken. The road grew darker as the city lights faded behind him, replaced by the isolation of the countryside. The ranch came into view, its silhouette stark against the night sky. He parked a distance away, ensuring his car wouldn't be spotted, and approached on foot. The ranch was quiet, its stillness almost mocking. Timothy's heart pounded as he moved closer, careful to stay hidden among the trees. When he reached the house, he peered through a partially open window. What he saw confirmed his worst fears. Rebecca and Ryan sat close on the worn leather couch, their laughter muffled but unmistakable. Ryan reached out to brush a strand of hair from Rebecca's face, his touch lingering far too long. Timothy felt his breath catch in his throat, his vision narrowing as rage consumed him. The man he had called his best friend was here, in this secluded sanctuary, with his wife. Timothy didn't remember deciding to move, his body acted before his mind could catch up. He stormed toward the front door, shoving it open with a force that made it crash against the wall. Rebecca and Ryan sprang apart, their expressions shifting from shock to panic as they realized who stood before them. Timothy. Rebecca gasped, her voice trembling. It's not what it looks like. Not what it looks like. Timothy's voice was low and sharp, a dangerous edge to his words. Then what is it, Rebecca? Enlighten me. Ryan stepped forward, his hands raised in a placating gesture. Tim, listen, let's talk about this. You're upset, and I understand, but... Don't you dare talk to me like you're innocent, Timothy snarled, his voice rising. You betrayed me. Both of you. The room seemed to shrink as the tension mounted, the air thick with unspoken accusations and raw emotion. Rebecca tried to step between the two men, her hands shaking as she reached out. Please, Timothy, let's just talk. Talk. Timothy barked out a bitter laugh. After everything you've done. I gave you everything, Rebecca. I trusted you, Ryan. And this is how you repay me. His eyes darted around the room, landing on the fireplace poker resting against the hearth. In a heartbeat, he grabbed it, the cold metal firm in his grip. Rebecca screamed, but the sound barely registered. His world had narrowed to Ryan, the man who had taken everything from him. Tim, don't, Ryan started, but his words were cut off as Timothy lunged forward. The poker swung with a sickening force, connecting with Ryan's head. The sound of metal meeting flesh echoed in the room, followed by the dull thud of Ryan's body hitting the floor. For a moment, there was silence. Rebecca dropped to her knees beside Ryan, her sobs filling the air as she frantically tried to wake him. But Ryan lay still, his eyes staring blankly, blood pooling beneath his head. Timothy stood frozen, the poker slipping from his hand and clattering to the floor. The weight of what he had done pressed down on him like a physical force. Ryan, his best friend since childhood, was dead. And it was his hand that had ended his life. We have to fix this, Rebecca whispered through her tears, her voice trembling. We can't, Timothy, we can't let anyone find out. Her words jolted him out of his stupor. Together, they moved in a haze of panic and desperation. They wiped down the room, erasing fingerprints and scattering furniture to make it look like a robbery gone wrong. The sight of Ryan's lifeless body was a constant, silent accusation as they worked. Later that night, under the cover of darkness, they loaded Ryan's body into Timothy's car. They drove deep into the woods, far from the ranch, where no one would stumble upon the scene. With shaking hands, Timothy dug a shallow grave, the cold earth resisting every strike of the shovel. Rebecca stood nearby, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, too numb to speak. When the grave was filled, they returned home, their clothes dirty, their minds reeling. The house, once a place of safety, now felt oppressive, its walls holding secrets too dark to bear. Timothy and Rebecca avoided each other's eyes, the weight of their actions hanging heavily between them. But the truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of surfacing. And the nightmare they thought they had contained was far from over. The morning air was crisp, carrying with it the promise of another uneventful day in the quiet suburbs of San Antonio. But for Timothy and Rebecca Dawson, peace was an illusion. The previous night's horrors lingered in every corner of their home. Rebecca sat at the kitchen table, her hands trembling as she clutched a cup of tea she hadn't touched. Across from her, Timothy stared at the floor, his face pale and drawn, his jaw tight with the weight of their secret. The illusion of calm was shattered just a few days later when Ryan Carter's disappearance was reported. He had missed a fishing trip with friends, a ritual he never skipped, and his phone had gone silent. Concerned, his friends contacted the police, and the search for Ryan began. Timothy and Rebecca had prepared for this. Their alibis were rehearsed, their home meticulously cleaned of any trace of the crime. But no amount of preparation could quell the rising panic that gnawed at both of them as the police began knocking on doors, asking questions about Ryan's last known whereabouts. Detectives visited the Dawson home soon after, their questions polite but probing. Timothy maintained a calm facade, explaining that he hadn't seen Ryan recently and suggesting that his friend might have taken an impromptu trip. Rebecca, however, struggled to mask her unease. Her voice wavered, her answers stilted, and she avoided eye contact. One of the detectives, a seasoned investigator named Detective Warren, noted her discomfort but didn't press her, yet. As the days turned into weeks, the investigation gained traction. A hiker stumbled upon a shallow grave deep in the woods and called the authorities. When the body was unearthed, it was badly decomposed, but the clothing and personal items were enough to suggest it was Ryan. Dental records confirmed the grim discovery, and the case shifted from a missing person to a homicide investigation. The Dawson household became a storm of tension. Rebecca was plagued by nightmares, waking in the middle of the night drenched in sweat and gasping for air. Timothy, on the other hand, grew colder, his focus solely on maintaining their cover story. They barely spoke, their shared guilt a chasm that widened with each passing day. Detective Warren and his team began piecing together Ryan's final days, interviewing friends, neighbors, and anyone who might have insight into his movements. The trail led back to the Dawsons. Maggie Taylor, ever observant, casually mentioned to the detectives that Ryan had been a frequent visitor to the Dawson home, especially when Timothy was away. Her remark, delivered with a touch of suspicion, was enough to warrant a closer look. When detectives revisited the Dawsons, their questions became more direct. They asked about Ryan's relationship with Rebecca, about Timothy's business trips, and about the tension that neighbors had noticed between the couple in recent weeks. Timothy's responses were measured, but Rebecca faltered. She stumbled over her words, her explanations riddled with inconsistencies that didn't escape Detective Warren's notice. The cracks in their story widened when forensic analysis revealed faint traces of blood in the Dawsons' living room. Despite their best efforts to clean, microscopic evidence lingered. Combined with the suspicions raised by Maggie's observations and Rebecca's shaky alibi, the detectives secured a search warrant for the house. The search yielded further evidence, small traces of blood on the fireplace poker, consistent with the blunt force trauma that had killed Ryan. The discovery was damning. Timothy was arrested on suspicion of murder, his calm demeanor finally breaking as he was led away in handcuffs. Rebecca, though not immediately charged, was brought in for further questioning. In the sterile confines of the interrogation room, under the harsh glare of fluorescent lights, Rebecca's composure crumbled. Faced with mounting evidence and relentless questioning, she confessed to the affair. Tears streamed down her face as she insisted she had nothing to do with Ryan's death, painting herself as a victim of circumstance. "I didn't want this to happen," she sobbed. "I never wanted anyone to get hurt." Her confession only deepened the detective's suspicions. While they couldn't yet prove her direct involvement in the murder, her role in the affair and the subsequent cover-up made her complicit in their eyes. As the case moved forward, the community watched in shock as the once perfect Dawson family unraveled in the public eye. The quiet suburban streets buzzed with gossip, neighbors exchanging whispered theories about how the couple's seemingly perfect life had spiraled into such darkness. Timothy's trial loomed on the horizon, and Rebecca's fate hung precariously in the balance. For Timothy, the weight of his actions bore down heavily. The evidence was overwhelming, the betrayal too deep, and the truth too undeniable. For Rebecca, the guilt of her affair and the knowledge that it had set this chain of events into motion was a burden she would carry forever. The walls had closed in, and the secrets they had tried so desperately to bury had come to light, bringing their carefully constructed world crashing down around them. The courtroom was silent, save for the faint scratching of pens and the occasional rustle of paper. Timothy Dawson sat at the defendant's table, his face pale and emotionless as the jury filed back into the room. Across the room, Rebecca Dawson sat in the audience, her eyes red and swollen, fixed on the man she once called her husband. The trial had been grueling, dragging every hidden truth into the harsh light of public scrutiny. Prosecutors painted a vivid picture of a man driven to murder by betrayal and fury, his actions spurred by the affair between his wife and his best friend. Defense attorneys, meanwhile, argued that the crime was one of passion, not premeditation, a desperate act committed in the heat of the moment. The testimony had been damning. The forensic evidence, the blood traces in the Dawson home, the fireplace poker, and the GPS logs, left little doubt about Timothy's actions. But it was Rebecca's testimony that held the most weight. She recounted the events leading up to the murder in a voice heavy with regret, admitting to the affair and her role in covering up the crime. Her words painted a tragic picture of a marriage built on lies and a decision that spiraled out of control. When the foreperson of the jury stood to deliver the verdict, the tension in the room was palpable. "We find the defendant, Timothy Dawson, guilty of second-degree murder." Rebecca let out a quiet sob as Timothy bowed his head, his hands clenched into fists. The judge's voice echoed through the courtroom as he delivered the sentence, 25 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 15. The weight of the judgment settled over the room, a grim reminder of how far they had fallen. For Rebecca, the aftermath of the trial was a different kind of punishment. Though she was not charged with any crime, her life was irreparably shattered. The community she once considered her home now turned its back on her. Whispers followed her wherever she went, at the grocery store, at the post office, even during church services. "That's her," they would murmur, their voices dripping with judgment. "The one who destroyed her marriage and caused all this." Rebecca's nights were haunted by nightmares of that fateful evening. The sight of Ryan's lifeless body burned into her mind. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Timothy's face, twisted in rage, his hands gripping the fireplace poker. She tried to move on, but the weight of her guilt and the scars of her choices clung to her, an invisible chain she could never break. She moved to a smaller town, far from the whispers and the stares, but peace remained elusive. The name, Rebecca Dawson, had become synonymous with betrayal and tragedy, and no distance could erase the shame she carried. Her attempts to rebuild her life were half-hearted at best. Relationships were fleeting, friends were few, and every new connection seemed tainted by the shadow of her past. Timothy, meanwhile, adjusted to life behind bars. In the silence of his prison cell, he replayed the events that led him there over and over again, his anger at Rebecca slowly giving way to regret. He hated what she had done, but he hated himself more for letting his emotions consume him. The man who had once been a pillar of control and logic had succumbed to his darkest impulses, and the cost had been more than he could bear. Letters occasionally passed between the two, their tone formal and devoid of the intimacy they once shared. Rebecca would update Timothy on mundane aspects of life outside, how the seasons had changed, how their old neighborhood looked. Timothy, in return, would write brief acknowledgments, his words carefully measured. They were strangers now, bound only by the ruin of what they once had. The community of San Antonio, too, was forever changed. The case became a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the most picture-perfect lives can harbor dark secrets. Friends and neighbors spoke of the Dawsons in hushed tones, each person casting their own judgment on who was truly to blame. Was it Rebecca, for her betrayal? Ryan, for his involvement with a married woman? Or Timothy, for letting his anger consume him so completely? The lessons were clear, but painfully earned. One decision, one moment of weakness, had set a chain of events into motion that none of them could stop. Love turned to betrayal, friendship to hatred, and trust to violence. The consequences rippled outward, touching everyone involved and leaving scars that would never fully heal. Rebecca, now living alone in her modest apartment, often found herself staring out the window, lost in thought. She would never say it out loud, but she knew that, in some way, they were all to blame. And yet, she carried the heaviest burden of all, the knowledge that her choices had set everything into motion. Just one decision, she whispered to herself on sleepless nights. Just one wrong decision. The past could not be undone, and the future was an uncertain void. All that remained were the lessons, etched into her soul and the lives of those she had hurt. The tragedy of the Dawson family would remain a haunting reminder of how easily everything can fall apart, and how some wounds never heal. The story of Rebecca, Timothy, and Ryan was one that would linger long after the final verdict was read. Their lives, once so ordinary, had become a tapestry of betrayal, rage, and tragedy, each thread woven tightly until it snapped. And while their actions had destroyed their lives, the echoes of their choices would resonate far beyond their small corner of San Antonio. Rebecca sat alone in her small, sparsely furnished apartment. The hum of the city outside was a far cry from the serene quiet of her former suburban life. Here, she was just another anonymous face in a sea of people, a relief from the piercing stares and whispered judgments she had left behind. Yet, anonymity came at a price. The isolation she had once feared now defined her existence. She often thought about Timothy. In their quiet moments together, long before the affair, there had been genuine love. It was easy to forget that now, with the weight of their shared destruction overshadowing every memory. She had tried to write him several times, but each letter remained unfinished, the words catching in her throat before they could find the page. What could she say? That she was sorry? That she still felt the ghost of their old life haunting her every step? None of it would matter. And then there was Ryan. His death was something she could never reconcile. He had been a comfort, a confidant, and for a fleeting moment, a source of joy in a life that had felt stagnant. But that joy came at a cost she hadn't foreseen. She had thought of Ryan as an escape, never imagining the firestorm their relationship would ignite. Now, when she thought of him, it wasn't with fondness but with a suffocating guilt that wrapped around her like a noose. The community that had once embraced her now spoke her name only in hushed tones. The Dawson's story had become a cautionary tale, whispered at backyard barbecues and dinner parties. "Did you hear about what happened to the Dawsons?" they would ask, their voices tinged with both horror and curiosity. For years, the details of the case would be dissected, exaggerated, and turned into suburban lore. Timothy, meanwhile, had adapted to life behind bars with a stoicism that belied the turmoil within. In prison, he found the kind of order he had once brought to his work, a rigid routine that left little room for introspection. Yet, when the lights went out, and the silence of the cell enveloped him, the memories returned. He thought of the life he had built with Rebecca, the sacrifices he had made to give them a future. He thought of Ryan, his closest friend, whose betrayal had stung deeper than anything he could have imagined. But more than anything, he thought of the moment he had picked up the fireplace poker, the rage that had consumed him, turning him into someone he no longer recognized. He replayed that moment endlessly, searching for the man he had been before it all fell apart. Letters from Rebecca came sporadically, though he rarely responded. Her words were filled with regret, but Timothy wasn't sure if they were meant for him or for herself. He would skim them, then tuck them into the corner of his small cell, letting them gather dust. He couldn't bring himself to destroy them, but neither could he bear to revisit them. For the rest of the world, life moved on. The headlines that had once screamed about the shocking murder faded, replaced by newer scandals and fresher tragedies. But for those who had been close to the Dawsons, the story lingered like a specter. Maggie Taylor, the neighbor who had unknowingly ignited Timothy's suspicions, often wondered if she could have done something differently. Friends of Ryan debated whether they should have seen the signs, if there had been a way to intervene before it was too late. And yet, no one could change the past. The choices had been made, the consequences endured. The tragedy of the Dawson family became a grim reminder that even the most ordinary lives could unravel under the weight of secrets and lies. Rebecca's days became a blur of solitude and small routines. She worked at a bookstore, where her interactions were limited to polite exchanges with customers. She avoided connections, fearful of the questions that would inevitably arise if anyone got too close. Her evenings were spent alone, staring out the window of her apartment at the world she no longer felt a part of. Sometimes, she imagined a different life, a life where she had chosen differently, where she had turned away from Ryan and worked to repair the cracks in her marriage. But those thoughts were fleeting, too painful to dwell on for long. The reality was what it was, and no amount of longing could undo the past. For Timothy, the years in prison were marked by quiet reflection. The anger that had once consumed him faded, replaced by a deep sadness for the life he had destroyed, not just Ryan's, but his own and Rebecca's as well. As the years passed, he began to wonder if he would ever find redemption, or if the weight of his choices would follow him long after his release. The story of Rebecca, Timothy, and Ryan wasn't one of villains and heroes. It was a story of flawed people, each making choices that spiraled into catastrophe. It was a reminder of the fragility of trust, the destructive power of betrayal, and the ways in which love, in all its forms, could both save and destroy. In the end, there were no winners, only lessons. And for those who knew the Dawsons, the story served as a haunting warning: be careful of the choices you make. Because sometimes, one wrong decision is all it takes to lose everything.